The words hit me like a punch to the gut. We were standing in Dad's office, surrounded by mahogany furniture and framed awards celebrating 30 years of building Carter Manufacturing. I just told him about my plan to start my own industrial supply company, and his response was exactly what I'd feared but hoped I wouldn't hear. "You'll never make it without my help, Adrian," he said, leaning back in his leather chair with that condescending smile I'd grown to hate. "You don't have the connections, the experience, or frankly, the talent. This business requires more than ambition. It requires wisdom you simply don't possess." I stood there, 28 years old, holding a business plan I'd spent 6 months developing. My hand was shaking, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm not asking for your help, Dad. I'm telling you what I'm going to do." He laughed, actually laughed like I told him a joke. "Without my network, you're nobody in this industry. Without my reputation backing you, no supplier will give you the time of day. You're setting yourself up for a spectacular failure." Something inside me shifted in that moment. The hurt transformed into determination, cold and sharp. "We'll see about that," I said quietly. I walked out his office, leaving my business plan on his desk. He could throw it away for all I cared. I didn't need his approval anymore. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, replaying the conversation over and over. Dad had always been critical, always found ways to diminish my achievements. When I graduated top of my class in business school, he'd said the program was too easy. When I worked at his company for 3 years, learning every aspect of operations, he dismissed my contributions as basic tasks anyone could handle. But this was different. This was him saying I was fundamentally incapable of success without him. I pulled out my laptop and started making lists. I had $47,000 in savings from my years working at Carter Manufacturing. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I had knowledge of the industry, contacts I'd made independently, and a business model I believed in. My plan was to create a supply company focused on small manufacturers, the ones Dad's company ignored because they weren't profitable enough. I'd offer better service, faster delivery, and personal attention. It was a niche Dad had never bothered with, which meant I wouldn't be competing directly with him at first. The research and planning consumed me. I worked until 3 a.m, mapping out suppliers, potential clients, and operational logistics. By dawn, I had a revised business plan that didn't rely on anything Dad had built. It was all mine from the ground up. The first month was brutal. I rented a small warehouse space on the industrial side of town, the kind of place with concrete floors and flickering fluorescent lights. I bought used office furniture and set up a desk in the corner. My first employee was myself. I spent days cold calling potential clients, explaining my services, trying to sound confident despite the fear gnawing at me. Most conversations ended with polite rejections. "We already have suppliers. We're not looking to make changes. Call back in 6 months." The rejections piled up, and doubt crept in like water through cracks. Maybe Dad was right. Maybe I didn't have what it took. Then came the meeting that nearly broke me. I'd finally secured an appointment with Palmer Industries, a mid-sized manufacturer that seemed perfect for my services. I prepared for a week, researched their needs, created a customized proposal. The meeting lasted 10 minutes. The owner, Gordon Palmer, barely looked at my materials. "Your father and I go way back," he said. "He called me yesterday. Told me you were inexperienced and unreliable. Said working with you would be a mistake." I felt my face burn with humiliation and rage. Dad had sabotaged me. He wasn't content to just refuse help. He was actively working against me. I thanked Palmer for his time and left, my proposal tucked under my arm like a failure I couldn't hide. I was sitting in my car outside Palmer Industries, seriously considering giving up when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. "Adrian Carter?" A woman's voice asked. "This is Natalie Reeves. I worked with you at Carter Manufacturing 3 years ago. I heard you started your own company." I remembered Natalie. She'd been one of the senior buyers, sharp and efficient. Someone who'd always treated me with respect even when Dad didn't. "That's right," I said carefully. "Why?" "I'm working as a consultant now, helping small companies optimize their supply chains. I like to grab coffee and talk about what you're building. We met the next day at a cafe downtown. Natalie was direct and honest. Your father mentioned your company in a meeting last week. He was dismissive, said you'd fail within 6 months. That made me curious. She smiled. I always thought you were one of the smartest people at Carter Manufacturing. Your ideas were good, but your father never listened. So when I heard you'd struck out on your own, I wanted to reach out. Natalie offered to help me refine my pitch, introduced me to contacts she'd made over her 20-year career, and provide advice as I navigated the early stages. Why would you help me? I asked, suspicious of generosity after years of Dad's conditional support. Because good people deserve a chance, she said simply, and because I think you'll succeed, and I want to be part of that story. With Natalie's help, things started shifting. She introduced me to 3 potential clients, small manufacturers who were frustrated with their current suppliers. I approached each meeting with renewed confidence, armed with better presentations and clearer value propositions. 2 of the 3 signed contracts. They were small deals, maybe $15,000 each in annual business. But they were mine, real clients who believed in what I was building. I hired my first employee, a warehouse manager named Kyle who'd been laid off from a larger company. He was overqualified and underpaid, but he believed in the vision. Together, we started fulfilling orders, working 16-hour days to ensure everything was perfect. Every delivery was on time. Every customer interaction was handled with care. Word began to spread slowly. One client referred another. That referral led to 2 more. By the end of my 3rd month, I had 8 clients and was generating enough revenue to cover expenses with a tiny profit margin. It wasn't success yet, but it was survival. Then Dad called. I hadn't spoken to him since walking out of his office. I heard you're still trying to make this work, he said, his tone suggesting he was doing me a favor by even calling. Look, I can offer you a position here. Entry-level management. It's not too late to come back and learn the business properly. The condescension in his voice made my jaw clench. I'm not coming back. Dad, I'm building something on my own. Dad's response was cold and final. Then you're on your own in every sense. Don't expect any help from me when this inevitably falls apart. I hung up feeling both liberated and terrified. Refusing his help meant truly betting everything on myself. No safety net, no backup plan, just me and the company I was building from nothing. That refusal became my defining moment. Every morning, I woke up knowing I'd chosen this path deliberately. Every challenge I faced was mine to solve. Every success was mine to celebrate. My business grew steadily through the fall and winter. I reinvested every dollar profit back into inventory and better equipment. I hired 2 more employees. I moved to a slightly larger warehouse. The progress was slow but real. Each step forward earned through long hours and careful planning. 6 months after starting, I had 23 clients and annual revenue approaching $400,000. It was nowhere near Dad's multi-million-dollar operation, but it was mine, built without his connections or approval. Then I got a call from one of Dad's former clients, a company called Riverside Manufacturing. We're looking to diversify our suppliers. The owner said, we've heard good things about your service and wanted to discuss a potential contract. My heart raced. This was a significant opportunity, the kind that could transform my company from surviving to thriving. But it also meant competing directly with Dad for the first time. The Riverside contract negotiations lasted 3 weeks. They were considering 2 suppliers, me and one of Dad's longtime partners. I knew Dad would hear about my bid, knew he'd try to interfere, but I couldn't let fear dictate my decisions. I put together the most comprehensive proposal I'd ever created, emphasizing personalized service, competitive pricing, and guaranteed response times. The presentation went well, but I left uncertain. A week later, I got the news. Riverside had chosen Dad's partner. The rejection stung, but the feedback was valuable. They'd been impressed with my proposal, but worried about my company's capacity to handle their volume. They needed proof I could scale. That night, everything that could go wrong did. A major shipment was delayed due to a supplier error. One of my biggest clients called threatening to cancel because of a billing mistake. My warehouse manager, Kyle, called in sick. I spent 18 hours putting out fires, managing crises, wondering if Dad had been right all along. Maybe I wasn't ready for this. Maybe I'd overestimated my abilities. I was sitting in my office at midnight, exhausted and defeated, when Natalie called. "I heard about Riverside," she said. "That's tough, but it's not the end. Every successful business faces setbacks. The question is whether you learn from them or let them destroy you." She was right. I spent the next day analyzing what went wrong and how to prevent similar problems in the future. Better systems, better communication, better planning. I would use this failure to build something stronger. 3 days after the Riverside rejection, I received an unexpected email. It was from Theodore Blackwell, a name I recognized as a legend in industrial supply. He'd built and sold 2 successful companies and now worked as a mentor and investor. "I've been watching your company with interest," his email read. "I'd like to meet and discuss your growth strategy." We met at his downtown office, a sleek space filled with modern art and floor-to-ceiling windows. Theodore was in his 60s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. "Your father and I competed for years," he said without preamble. "I retired when he was still building Carter Manufacturing. I've heard he's not supportive of your venture." I confirmed it carefully, unsure where this was going. Theodore smiled. "Good. That means you're hungry and you're learning to fight. Those are the qualities that build empires, not inherited connections." Over the next 2 hours, Theodore dissected my business model, pointed out weaknesses I hadn't seen, and suggested strategies for sustainable growth. His advice was worth more than any textbook or seminar. "I'm not offering money," he said as we finished. "You need to build this yourself. But I'm offering guidance, honest feedback, and connections to people who value merit over pedigree. Use them wisely." I left that meeting energized. Theodore's belief in my potential was a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. His support wasn't financial or transactional. It was a kind that challenged me to be better, sharper, more strategic. Over the next year, my company transformed. Theodore's advice helped me streamline operations, negotiate better supplier terms, and target the right clients. My revenue doubled, then tripled. I moved to a proper facility with modern equipment and hired 15 employees. But the real breakthrough came when I noticed something interesting. Dad's company, Carter Manufacturing, was struggling. Their quarterly reports, which were publicly available since they'd taken on outside investors, showed declining profits and customer retention issues. Dad had been so focused on maintaining his legacy and reputation that he'd stopped innovating. His company was running on systems developed 20 years ago, serving the same large clients with the same mediocre service they'd always provided. Meanwhile, the industry was changing. Smaller, more agile companies like mine were winning business by offering what big established firms couldn't: flexibility, personal attention, and modern technology. I saw an opportunity. One of Dad's suppliers, a critical partner who provided specialized components, was unhappy with how Carter Manufacturing handled their relationship. Through Natalie's network, I learned they were considering ending the partnership. I reached out to them directly. The conversation was straightforward. I explained my vision, demonstrated my company's growth trajectory, and offered them a partnership based on mutual respect rather than Dad's take-it-or-leave approach. They agreed to work with me. That single move gave me access to products Dad relied on, products I could now offer to potential clients at better prices with better service. 3 months after securing that supplier relationship, Dad reached out. He wanted to meet for lunch, said it was time we talked business properly. I agreed, curious about what he wanted. We met at an expensive downtown restaurant, the kind of place Dad always chose to remind people of his success. He looked older than I remembered, more tired. The stress of running a struggling company was showing. "I've been watching your progress," he said after we ordered. "You've done better than I expected." That supplier partnership was clever. There was no warmth in his voice, just grudging acknowledgement. "I want to offer you something. Come work for me again. Senior management position, real authority, good salary. We could combine our strengths, build something bigger together." I looked at my father across the table and saw him clearly for the first time. This wasn't about partnership or family. This was about him trying to neutralize a competitor and regain access to the supplier I'd stolen from him. "I'm not interested in working for you, Dad," I said calmly. "I'm building my own path." His expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. The industry is tough, and you're still vulnerable. I could crush you if I wanted to, but you haven't," I pointed out, "because you can't. I'm not competing on your terms anymore. I'm building something different, something better." I left that lunch feeling clear-headed and certain. Dad would never see me as anything but a threat or a tool. I had to accept that and move forward without needing his approval. 6 months later, I made the boldest move of my career. Riverside Manufacturing, the client who'd rejected me a year earlier, put out a new request for proposals. Their current supplier had failed them repeatedly, and they were ready to make a change. This time, I was ready. My company had grown substantially. We now had the capacity, the track record, and the systems to handle their volume. I put together a proposal that addressed every concern they'd had previously, backed up with data and testimonials from satisfied clients. The presentation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I brought Kyle and 2 other key employees, presenting as a unified team rather than a single desperate entrepreneur. We walked them through our capabilities, our technology, our commitment to service excellence. 3 days later, Riverside called. We'd won the contract. It was worth $200,000 annually, the biggest deal my company had ever secured. But more importantly, it was a client Dad had been trying to win for years. I'd beaten him at his own game. The contract signing was scheduled for the following week. I was reviewing the final documents when Natalie called with interesting news. "I heard through the grapevine that Carter Manufacturing is having serious financial troubles," she said. "Rumor is they might need to sell off parts of the business to stay afloat." My mind started racing. If Dad's company was truly struggling, there might be opportunities one hadn't considered. Opportunities to not just compete with him, but to actually acquire pieces of what he'd built. The more I investigated, the clearer the picture became. Carter Manufacturing wasn't just struggling. It was in serious trouble. Years of poor management, outdated systems, and losing key clients had created a downward spiral. Dad had been borrowing against the company's assets to maintain appearances, but the debt was becoming unsustainable. I spent weeks analyzing their financial situation, studying which parts of the business were valuable and which were liabilities. The manufacturing division was struggling, but their distribution network was solid. Their client relationships were weakening, but their warehouse facilities were in prime locations. I started making quiet inquiries through intermediaries, testing whether parts of Dad's empire might be available for purchase. The responses were encouraging. Dad's investors were nervous and pushing him to make changes. Meanwhile, my own company continued thriving. We expanded to 40 employees and annual revenue of $3 million. I'd gone from barely surviving to genuinely succeeding, all without Dad's help. Theodore called one evening with a proposition. "There's a private equity firm interested in your growth story. They're willing to provide capital if you want to make acquisitions." Specifically, they mentioned Carter Manufacturing as a potential target. The irony was almost poetic. 3 years ago, Dad had told me I'd never make it without his help. Now I was in a position to buy pieces of his company. "Let's explore it," I told Theodore. "But carefully, I want to do this right." The acquisition process moved faster than I expected. Within 6 weeks, I'd secured funding and assembled a team to evaluate which parts of Carter Manufacturing made sense to purchase. But there was someone else helping behind the scenes, someone I hadn't identified. Money appeared at critical moments. Doors opened that should have been closed. Connections materialized with perfect timing. Someone with resources and influence was quietly supporting my bid, but they remained anonymous. I mentioned it to Theodore during one of our regular meetings. He smiled mysteriously. Sometimes people believe in potential they see in others. Sometimes successful people remember what it was like to fight without support. Don't worry about who's helping. Focus on making smart decisions and building something that lasts. The anonymous support continued. When I needed an introduction to Carter Manufacturing's largest creditor, the meeting was arranged within days. When I required detailed financial analysis of their operations, comprehensive reports appeared from sources I couldn't trace. It felt like I had a guardian angel in the business world, someone powerful who wanted me to succeed but preferred to remain invisible. Meanwhile, Dad remained unaware of my intentions. He knew his company was struggling, knew he might need to sell assets, but he had no idea his son was positioning to buy them. The element of surprise was crucial. If Dad knew I was involved, he'd fight harder, make the process more difficult out of pride. I needed to move carefully and strike decisively when the moment came. By my 4th year in business, my company had grown beyond anything I'd imagined that day in Dad's office. Annual revenue hit $7 million. We had locations in 3 cities. Our client list included some of the most respected manufacturers in the region. And now I was ready to make my move on Carter Manufacturing. The opportunity came through their distribution division. Dad's investors were pressuring him to sell non-core assets to reduce debt. The distribution network, worth an estimated $4 million, was on the market. I put together a bid through a shell company, keeping my involvement hidden. The offer was competitive but not excessive, structured to be attractive to Dad's desperate investors, while leaving me room for future growth. 3 weeks later, my bid was accepted. I now own the distribution network that Dad had spent 15 years building. The acquisition gave me instant credibility in the industry, access to established relationships, and physical assets that doubled my company's footprint overnight. But I still hadn't revealed my involvement. The deal was structured through intermediaries, and Dad had no idea his son now controlled a critical piece of his former empire. I planned to keep it that way until the right moment. The acquisition also put me in direct competition with Dad in ways I'd carefully avoided before. His remaining business relied on distribution channels I now controlled. I could strangle his operations if I chose to, or I could be generous and maintain existing arrangements. The power dynamic had completely reversed. The second acquisition came 6 months later. Carter Manufacturing's warehouse facilities, 3 prime properties in industrial zones, went up for sale. Dad's company was hemorrhaging money, and the investors wanted to liquidate assets quickly. Again, I bid through intermediaries. Again, my offer was accepted. I now own 2 major pieces of Dad's legacy, pieces he'd spent decades building, purchased at a fraction of their true value because his mismanagement had made them desperate to sell. The warehouse purchase was when things got complicated. Dad had to be notified about the new owner because of existing lease agreements with his company. When his lawyer called to discuss terms, they mentioned the purchasing entity's name. I heard later from one of his employees that Dad spent an hour trying to figure out who owned the shell company, digging through public records, making calls, trying to understand who was dismantling his empire. He still didn't know it was me, but the paranoia was eating at him. He could feel his control slipping away, could sense that someone was strategically acquiring the pieces of his company, but he couldn't identify his opponent. Then came the confrontation I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Dad showed up at my office unannounced, pushing past my assistant before she could stop him. He looked terrible, older and worn down. "Who's buying my company?" he demanded. "You have connections now. You hear things. Someone's systematically taking apart everything I built, and I need to know who." I looked at my father, this man who'd told me I'd never succeed, who'd sabotaged my early attempts, who'd dismissed my abilities at every turn. "I don't know what you're talking about." I lied smoothly. Dad's visit shook me more than I wanted to admit. Part of me wanted to reveal everything right then, to see the recognition and shock on his face. But Theodore's advice echoed in my mind. Timing is everything. Move too fast, and you give your opponent time to counter. Wait for the perfect moment. So I stayed quiet and kept positioning for the final move. Carter Manufacturing was barely holding on, sustained by increasingly desperate measures. Dad had taken on more debt, cut corners on quality, and was losing clients faster than he could replace them. The company that had once been his pride was becoming his albatross. Meanwhile, my company thrived. We'd hit $10 million in annual revenue. Industry publications were writing articles about our growth and innovation. I was being invited to speak at conferences, to serve on advisory boards, to mentor other entrepreneurs. Everything Dad had said I couldn't achieve without him, I'd accomplished on my own terms. The final piece of Dad's company became available that fall. The manufacturing division itself, the core of Carter Manufacturing, was going to be sold. The investors had lost patience completely. They wanted out, and they were willing to take offers that would give them any return on their failed investment. This was it, the moment I'd been building toward for 4 years. I could buy the manufacturing division, absorb it into my company, and completely take over Dad's legacy. But doing so would destroy him utterly, would erase his life's work and replace it with mine. I struggled with the decision for weeks. Theodore and I discussed the ethical implications over dinner one evening. "You have the right to buy it," he said. "You've earned this position through hard work and smart decisions. But you need to be clear about your motivations. Are you doing this to build a stronger company or to punish your father?" The question haunted me. Honestly, it was both. The manufacturing division would make strategic sense for my company. We'd have vertical integration, better margins, more control over quality and delivery. But I'd be lying if I said revenge wasn't part of the appeal. I wanted Dad to know what it felt like to be dismissed and diminished. I wanted him to understand that his low opinion of me had been completely wrong. In the end, I decided to move forward, not primarily for revenge, but because it was the right business decision. If I passed on this opportunity, someone else would buy it, and I'd have missed a chance to build something truly significant. I put together my bid, this time without hiding my involvement. The offer was structured to give Dad's investors a clean exit, while giving me full control of the manufacturing operations. It was generous enough to be attractive, but firm enough to be taken seriously. The bid was submitted on a Monday. By Wednesday, I had a response. The investors wanted to accept, but there was one condition. They wanted Dad's approval, some final dignity for the man who'd founded the company. Dad had to sign off on selling his life's work to his son. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday at the law office handling the transaction. I arrived early, my lawyer and financial advisor with me. Dad came alone, looking smaller somehow, like the past few years had physically diminished him. We sat across from each other at a massive conference table, while lawyers explained the terms. Dad listened in silence, his face unreadable. When they finished, he looked directly at me for the first time. "You," he said quietly. "It's been you this whole time. The distribution network, the warehouses, now this. You've been dismantling everything I built." I met his gaze steadily. "I've been building something new, using pieces you couldn't hold together. There's a difference." "How?" he asked, and for the first time I heard something other than condescension in his voice. He sounded genuinely baffled. "How did you do this without me? I told you that you'd never make it." "That's exactly why I succeeded," I said. "Because you didn't help. Because I had to learn every lesson the hard way, make every decision myself, earn every victory through actual work instead of inherited connections. You thought you were predicting my failure. You were actually ensuring my success." The lawyers shifted uncomfortably. This was supposed to be a business transaction, not family therapy. But Dad and I needed this conversation. We'd been building toward it for 4 years. "I was wrong," Dad said finally, the words seeming to cause him physical pain. "About you, about your abilities. I didn't see what you were capable of because I was too focused on protecting my own legacy." Dad's admission hung in the air, unexpected and raw. I'd imagined this moment hundreds of times, always thinking I'd feel triumphant. Instead, I felt sad. Sad for the years we'd wasted, for the relationship we'd damaged, for the pride that had kept us apart. "I need to understand something," Dad continued. "How did you finance these acquisitions? You couldn't have built that kind of capital in 4 years, not without significant backing." I explained the growth trajectory, the smart investments, the strategic partnerships. I mentioned Theodore's mentorship and the anonymous investor who'd supported me at crucial moments. "Anonymous?" Dad's eyes narrowed. "You don't know who's been funding you." "I know they believe in what I'm building. That's enough." Dad laughed bitterly. "You're more naive than I thought. Nobody backs a venture this size without wanting something in return. You probably sold your company without even realizing it." His words planted a seed of doubt, but I pushed it aside. The terms are clear. The support has been advisory and financial, but I maintain controlling interest in everything. I built this, Dad. Me. With help, yes, but ultimately through my own decisions and work. We'll see, he said cryptically. Then he turned to the lawyers. What happens if I don't sign? If I refuse to approve this sale? The lead attorney explained that the investors had the legal right to overrule him, but they preferred his cooperation to avoid potential litigation. So I have no real power here, Dad said. I can make things difficult, but I can't actually stop this. No, I confirmed. You can't. Dad signed the documents with a shaking hand. I watched him initial each page, transferring ownership of his life's work to me. When it was done, he stood up without a word and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back. You won, he said. I hope you know what to do with it. Then he was gone. The lawyers congratulated me. I now own Carter Manufacturing in its entirety, integrated into my own company. We'd need a new name, a new brand identity, but the foundation was solid. I had assets worth over $20 million and the infrastructure to grow even larger. But the victory felt hollow without Dad's respect, without genuine reconciliation. Over the following weeks, I worked with my leadership team to integrate the acquired operations. We updated systems, retrained employees, and implemented the quality standards that had made my original company successful. I kept every employee who wanted to stay, offering better pay and working conditions than they'd had under Dad's increasingly desperate management. The transformation was remarkable. Within 3 months, the formerly struggling manufacturing division was profitable again. Within 6 months, we'd won back clients who'd left during Dad's decline. The company I'd built was now a legitimate industry leader, competing with players 10 times our size and winning based on service quality and innovation. But I couldn't stop thinking about Dad, about how he looked signing away his company, about the years of conflict between us. For months after the acquisition, Dad called me. His voice sounded different, quieter and less certain. I need to talk to you, he said. Can we meet? We met at a coffee shop, neutral territory, neither of our offices with their complicated associations. Dad looked better than he had at the signing, like he'd been sleeping properly for the first time in years. I'm facing financial trouble, he said without preamble. Personal trouble. I borrowed heavily against my stake in the company, and those loans are coming due. I'm going to lose everything if I can't get help. I sipped my coffee, waiting for him to continue. I know I have no right to ask, he said. Not after everything I said and did. But you're my son, and I'm asking for help. The irony was almost too perfect. Dad, who'd told me I'd never make it without him, was now asking me for rescue. The man who dismissed my abilities needed me to save him from the consequences of his own failures. Part of me wanted to refuse, to let him experience the same desperation I'd felt starting out. But Theodore's words came back to me. Success isn't about revenge. It's about building something that lasts. I'll help you, I said, but on certain conditions. You'll work for me, not as an executive, but as an advisor. You'll share your knowledge and experience honestly, without the condescension, and you'll acknowledge publicly that I built this success independently. Dad's face showed a mix of relief and humiliation. Those are fair terms, he said quietly. Dad started working at my company the following Monday. I gave him an office, modest but comfortable, and a role consulting on strategic partnerships. He'd spent decades building relationships in the industry, and that knowledge had value if he was willing to share it honestly. The first few weeks were awkward. Employees who remembered him as their demanding boss now saw him taking direction from his son. Dad struggled with the role reversal, often catching himself about to give orders before remembering his position. But slowly, something shifted. Working together without the weight of his ego and my resentment, we started communicating effectively. Dad's insights on supplier negotiations were genuinely valuable. My approaches to technology and employee relations impressed him. We were learning from each other in ways that would have been impossible before. One afternoon, Dad knocked on my office door with a hesitant expression. Can I show you something? He'd been reviewing old files from Carter Manufacturing and found strategic plans he developed 20 years ago, plans for expansion and innovation that he'd never implemented because they seemed too risky. "These ideas," I said, reading through them, "they're good. Why didn't you execute them?" "Fear," Dad admitted. "Fear of losing what I'd built. I became so focused on protecting my legacy that I stopped growing it. That's what killed the company more than anything else." It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, and it changed something fundamental between us. Dad was finally seeing me clearly, and I was finally seeing him as a flawed human rather than an insurmountable obstacle. 6 months into our new working relationship, something remarkable happened. Dad and I were presenting together at an industry conference, sharing the stage to discuss business transformation. The audience was packed with competitors, clients, and curious observers wanting to see how this father-son story had played out. Dad spoke first, telling the story from his perspective. He didn't make excuses or minimize his mistakes. He talked honestly about how pride and fear had blinded him, how he'd underestimated his son, and damaged their relationship through arrogance. When it was my turn, I talked about the journey of building something from nothing, about the importance of believing in yourself when nobody else does, about forgiveness and growth. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Afterward, several young entrepreneurs approached us, sharing their own stories of family conflict and business challenges. We talked with them for hours, offering advice and encouragement. That's when I realized the real value of what Dad and I had built together, not the company or the assets, but the relationship we repaired and the example we could set for others. Our story wasn't about revenge or triumph. It was about two flawed people who'd hurt each other, then found a way to grow beyond their mistakes. Later that evening, Dad and I sat in a hotel bar, reviewing the day. "I'm proud of you," he said suddenly, "not just for what you've built, but for who you've become. You're a better man than I was at your age. Maybe a better man than I've ever been." The company continued growing, but I started thinking beyond just business success. I'd proven everything I needed to prove, built everything I'd set out to build. Now it was time to use that success for something larger. I established a foundation focused on supporting young entrepreneurs, especially those who didn't have family backing or traditional advantages. The foundation provided seed funding, mentorship, and educational resources. Dad threw himself into the foundation work with unexpected passion. He met with young business owners, shared his experiences, and became genuinely invested in their success. Watching him mentor others with patience and encouragement he'd never shown me was bittersweet, but ultimately healing. One of our first foundation recipients was a 26-year-old woman named Keisha who wanted to start a sustainable manufacturing company. Her parents thought it was foolish. Traditional lenders wouldn't take her seriously. But her business plan was solid, her passion authentic. We gave her a $50,000 grant and 6 months of intensive mentorship. 2 years later, her company was thriving, and she credited our support as the difference between success and giving up. Stories like Keisha's became common. The foundation supported over 40 entrepreneurs in its first 3 years, with a success rate far above industry averages. Dad and I spoke at schools and community centers, sharing our story and encouraging others to pursue their dreams despite obstacles. The work was more fulfilling than any business deal I'd ever closed. 5 years after that confrontation in Dad's office, I stood in our company headquarters, looking at what we'd built. Annual revenue had reached $43 million. We employed over 200 people across 6 locations. Industry publications ranked us as one of the fastest-growing companies in the region. But the numbers weren't what mattered most. What mattered was the young entrepreneurs we'd helped, the families we employed, the example we'd set about overcoming conflict and building something meaningful. Dad was retiring officially next month, though he continued working with the foundation. At his retirement party, he gave a speech that brought tears to many eyes, including mine. "I spent 30 years building a company," he said, "but I almost destroyed the most important thing I had. My relationship with my son. Adrian didn't just take over my business. He transformed it, improved it, and used it as a foundation for something better than I ever imagined. The real legacy isn't the buildings or the revenue. It's the lives we've touched and the example we've set about humility, growth, and second chances." After the party, Dad and I sat in my office, Just the two of us. Thank you, he said simply, for not giving up on me, even when I deserved it. Thank you for finally seeing me, I replied. We sat in comfortable silence. Two men who'd fought bitterly and found their way back to each other. My success hadn't required his help initially, but it was richer and more meaningful for having him as part of it now. That night, I drove home thinking about the journey. 5 years ago, I'd walked out of Dad's office determined to prove him wrong. I'd built a company, acquired his empire, and demonstrated capabilities he'd said I didn't possess. But the real victory wasn't the business success or the financial growth. It was learning that proving yourself to others is less important than proving yourself to yourself. It was discovering that success without reconciliation feels empty. It was understanding that the strongest thing you can do is extend grace to someone who hurt you. My phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. Saw the conference video. You and your father were amazing together. This is what happens when good people get the chances they deserve. I smiled and texted back my thanks. Then I pulled up my company's financial dashboard, looking at the numbers that represented 5 years of relentless work, strategic decisions, and refusing to accept other people's limitations on my potential. The next morning, I had a meeting with a young entrepreneur whose father had told him he'd never make it in business. The kid was 24, ambitious, and terrified. I saw myself in his nervous energy and determined eyes. Let me tell you a story, I said, leaning back in my chair, about what's possible when someone tells you that you can't succeed without them. I shared everything. The rejection, the struggle, the small victories that built toward larger ones, the importance of finding people who believe in you, and ultimately, the power of forgiveness and growth. The young man listened intently, taking notes, asking questions. So the lesson is to prove them wrong? He asked when I finished. No, I said. The lesson is to prove yourself right. Proving others wrong is just a side effect. The real work is believing in yourself enough to keep going when everything seems impossible, and being generous enough to help others up once you've climbed the mountain yourself. He left my office with a foundation grant check and a mentorship commitment. Another person getting the chance. I'd had to build something from nothing. That afternoon, Dad stopped by my office. He'd been going through more old files from Carter Manufacturing, finding forgotten projects and abandoned ideas. Look at this, he said, spreading documents across my desk. I had plans for sustainable manufacturing processes 15 years ago. Never implemented them because they seemed too expensive. I studied the plans. They were surprisingly forward-thinking, addressing environmental concerns before they became industry priorities. We should revisit these, I said, update them with current technology, and see if they're viable now. Dad's face lit up. You really think so? I think you had good ideas that deserve better execution. Let's give them another chance. We spent the next hour discussing possibilities, building on Dad's old concepts with new approaches. It felt like collaboration instead of competition, like we were finally working together instead of against each other. That evening, I attended a foundation event where several of our grant recipients were presenting their progress. Keisha spoke about her sustainable manufacturing company, now employing 15 people and expanding into new markets. A young man named Tyler talked about his tech startup that was revolutionizing inventory management. A woman named Sophia shared how her family business had transformed after receiving our mentorship and support. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads. Determination, resilience, the willingness to work harder than anyone thought possible, and the importance of believing in yourself when others don't. Dad sat beside me, watching presentations with genuine interest and pride. This is better than anything I built, he whispered. These people will build things we can't even imagine, and we help make it possible. He was right. The foundation's impact would outlast any business success, creating ripples of opportunity that would spread far beyond what we could measure or control. After the event, several attendees approached us with questions and thanks. They wanted advice, wanted to share their struggles, wanted to know how we'd overcome our own conflicts. We stayed for hours, talking with anyone who wanted to talk, offering encouragement and practical guidance. This was what success looked like now. Not just building wealth or winning competitions, but using what we'd learned to lift others up, On the drive home, I thought about the anonymous investor who'd supported me during crucial moments. I still didn't know their identity, though I'd stopped worrying about their motivations. Whoever they were, they'd helped me when I needed it, and I was paying that forward through the foundation. Maybe that was the real lesson. Success isn't a solo journey, even when you're building something independently. People help you in visible and invisible ways. The measure of your character is whether you extend that help to others once you're capable. The next morning brought news that changed everything again. Theodore called with information he'd been sitting on for months, waiting for the right moment to share. "Your anonymous investor," he said. "I finally figured out who it was." My heart raced. "Who?" "Your father." I sat down hard, trying to process his revelation. "What?" Theodore explained. After our initial confrontation, after Dad had dismissed my business plans, he'd watched from a distance. When I started gaining traction, when my early successes suggested I might actually make it, he'd begun supporting me secretly. The connections that opened unexpectedly, the funding that appeared at critical moments, the opportunities that seemed too convenient to be coincidental, they'd all been orchestrated by Dad. "He couldn't bring himself to support you openly," Theodore said. "His pride wouldn't allow it. But he also couldn't watch you fail. So he helped behind the scenes, through intermediaries and anonymous channels, giving you what you needed while maintaining his public position that you'd never make it without him." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. All this time, I thought I'd built everything independently, proved I didn't need Dad's help. But he'd been there all along, supported me in the only way his complicated pride would allow. "Does he know that you know?" I asked Theodore. "Not unless you tell him." I only figured it out because I know how to trace financial patterns that most people miss. Your father was very careful to hide his involvement. I hung up and sat in my office for an hour, rethinking everything I thought I understood about my journey. The narrative I constructed about succeeding despite Dad's opposition wasn't exactly true. I'd succeeded with his secret support, which was somehow more complicated and more meaningful than either pure independence or overt help would have been. That evening, I confronted Dad in his office at the foundation headquarters. "I know about the anonymous investments," I said without preamble. "I know you were supporting me the whole time." Dad's face went pale, then red, cycling through emotions too quickly to name. Finally, he sagged in his chair. "Theodore told you." "Why?" I asked. "Why help me while publicly dismissing me? Why make it so complicated?" Dad was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Because I'm a stubborn, prideful man who couldn't admit he was wrong. I said you'd fail without me, and I couldn't back down from that position. But I also couldn't stand by and watch you actually fail. So I helped secretly, telling myself it didn't count if you didn't know about it." "That's twisted logic, Dad." "I know, but it's the truth." He looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I'm sorry. For all of it. For the criticism. For the sabotage. For the complicated half-support that was probably worse than no support at all. You deserved a father who believed in you openly and completely. Instead, you got me." I sat down across from him, processing this new understanding of our relationship. You know what the crazy thing is? Part of me is angry that I didn't build this completely independently. But another part is relieved, because it means you never really wanted me to fail. You were just too proud to admit you were wrong about me. "That's exactly right," Dad said. And I regret that pride for the rest of my life. We talked for hours that night, untangling years of complicated emotions and misunderstandings. The truth was messy and imperfect, like most family relationships. Dad hadn't been the villain I'd painted him as, but he also hadn't been innocent. I hadn't been as independent as I believed, but I'd still earned every success through genuine work and smart decisions. The next day, I called an all-hands meeting at the company. Every employee, every department head, every person who'd been part of building our success. Dad attended, sitting in the back, unsure of his role in this moment. "I need to tell you all something," I said. "A truth about how this company was really built." I explained everything. Dad's initial rejection, my determination to prove him wrong, the secret support I hadn't known about, and the complicated journey that led us to where we were now. The lesson here isn't simple, I continued. It's not believe in yourself and you'll succeed. It's not family always supports you. It's something more complicated and more real. Success comes from multiple sources. Your own work, unexpected help, difficult relationships that push you to grow, and the willingness to forgive and move forward when the truth is messy. The room was silent. Then, unexpectedly, applause started. Not polite corporate applause, but genuine, enthusiastic recognition of honesty and vulnerability. After the meeting, employees approached both Dad and me, sharing their own stories of complicated family relationships and business challenges. We'd given them permission to acknowledge that success isn't clean or simple, that it's okay to have mixed feelings about the people who helped and hurt you. That night, Dad and I had dinner together, just the two of us. I have one question, I said. When you told me I'd never make it without your help, did you actually believe that? Or were you testing me? Dad thought for a long moment. Honestly, I believed it. I thought you were too young, too inexperienced, too naive about how brutal this industry can be. But I also hoped I was wrong. And when you started proving me wrong, I was proud and terrified in equal measure. Proud of your success, terrified of what it said about my own limitations. We both had things to learn, I said. You had to learn that your way wasn't the only way. I had to learn that accepting help doesn't diminish your accomplishments. So what now? Dad asked, where do we go from here? I smiled. Forward. Together. Building something that matters more than either of our egos or our need to be right. The company continued growing, but now with a clearer understanding of its foundation. I'd built something real, with help that was both visible and invisible, through work that was both independent and supported. The contradictions didn't weaken the achievement. They made it more human and more true. 5 years became 10. The company's value reached over $100 million. The foundation supported hundreds of entrepreneurs. Dad and I became known not just for business success, but for our honest discussions about family, pride, failure, and redemption. Looking back on that moment in Dad's office when he told me I'd never make it without him, I realized he was both completely wrong and oddly right. Wrong because I built capabilities and success he never believed I possessed. Right because none of us truly makes it alone. We all need support, guidance, opportunities, and second chances. The real triumph wasn't proving Dad wrong or building a successful company. It was learning that strength isn't about independence. It's about acknowledging your interconnections, accepting help with grace, offering help with generosity, and building something larger than your own need for validation. That lesson, more than any business achievement, was what I hope to pass on to the next generation of entrepreneurs who walk through our doors looking for their own chances to build something from nothing. Because in the end, we all need someone to believe in us, even if that belief comes wrapped in complication, pride, and imperfect love.